Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I'm with Dmitri Trenin, the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, a respected think tank in Moscow, and Asoke Mukerji, a former Indian diplomat. He has served in a senior position in India's mission in Moscow, as well as in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, as well as been India's permanent representative at the UN. And today we are discussing the importance of the Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to India. It's an important visit. It's an old relationship between India and Russia, and of course the former Soviet Union. But in recent times, certain tensions have crept in. It's the C word, China. We will discuss this and many other issues over the next half an hour. Gentlemen, Dr. Trenin and Mr. Mukerji, welcome to the Print Debates.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thank you.
So, Dr. Trenin, to you first. You're sitting in your dacha outside Moscow. It seems like a really warm place, but of course it's snowing outside, as you just said. But the question to you first, the visit of President Putin to India, what do you think is the significance of this visit?
Well, first of all, it's only the second visit outside the country that Mr. Putin will be making. The other visit was in June to Geneva to sit down with President Biden. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important. A lot of other meetings that Putin would have attended, he preferred to have via video links. So it's important. It certainly shows the symbolism of the continuing friendly relationship with India. But I hope it's more than that, because we will be discussing that in this program, I think. But it's a good relationship, but it's not a great relationship anymore for a number of reasons. And the task for both India and Russia, I believe, is to work hard to make it great again.
So okay, let me come back to you. Mr. Mukerji, in your view, why is it that President Putin's visit to India is being looked at with, of course, a great deal of warmth, anticipation, warmth, but also some concern? What do you think that's all about?
Well, I think that the concern stems from developments that are taking place in the world, which pose their own challenges for Russia and for India. I think that President Putin's decision to physically travel to India for the summit, the first country in Asia he's going to after the pandemic was declared, which by itself is significant, shows that there is not only a need to have a discussion with Prime Minister Modi, but also to show that the two leaders are in physical proximity to each other. And I think that as Mr. Trenin mentioned in the case of United States, that decision was also taken to travel to Geneva to have a physical meeting with the new American president, President Biden. So I think that through these two decisions, the Russian president is actually sending a strong diplomatic signal of the priorities that Russia today has set for itself in its engagement with its partners. The reason why there is some concern, I think that depends on who you speak to. In the energy sector, there doesn't appear to be any concern among Indian and Russian counterparts. They are, in fact, moving ahead quite quickly to implement decisions taken in the summits prior to this.
Okay.
And so on. So we can come back to those issues. But I think that the concern is mainly a concern of perception of some, but not a perception overall. I would not share that concern.
Okay, so Dr. Trenin, I've been reading your piece on the Carnegie Moscow Center website, in which you talk about how there is a need to rethink, adjust, and upgrade the relationship. I mean, that's quite interesting. In fact, I would urge the viewers of this debate to also go to your article. But tell me, what do these three words mean? Rethink, adjust, and upgrade.
Well, I think that first of all, thank you for paying attention to that fairly short piece. Rethink means that First of all, this piece is beamed primarily at the Russian audience, at Russian decision makers and those who are advising them. I think that the main thesis of the rethink part is that in Russia, one has to accept India's rise to the position of a major world power.
You don't think the Russians have accepted that?
Well, I think that for many Russians, the idea of India as a country out there, large, but essentially third world, friendly, with limited ambitions, a trusted friend of many decades. So a country that you sometimes look at with a lot of friendship, but also in a somewhat patronizing way. Mm-hmm. And I'll be very, very frank with you. And that, I think, must go. India is a major power that is developing its own view, not just of the region, but of the world more broadly. It has a lot of room to go to grow to an even bigger position. So India needs to be seen as a major world player. And for Russia, the view of India as a country that follows its own path, its own vocation, if you like, is very important. Because also talking about concerns, there are some concerns on the Russian side. For example, some Russians are concerned about India's rapprochement with the United States. Some people would look at India's Indo-Pacific strategy as something germane with the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Some people even think that India might follow the United States, given both countries very, let's say, negative is too strong a word in India's case, but very apprehensive attitudes toward China.
Mm-hmm. So you don't look at India. You don't look at India as an independent-minded power.
No. For many people, it's still a country whose image was shaped in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, the heyday of Indo-Soviet relationship. Again, there's a friendly attitude toward India, but this friendliness, I think, is too often in the Russian case married to underappreciation of what India has become, particularly in the last 3 decades. So this is the rethink part.
Right.
The adjust part is draw conclusions from the rethink. Mm-hmm. Deal with India much more intensively, much more broadly, much more intimately on a broader range of issues, which includes the world order, which includes the UN agenda, which includes climate and other global issues, the pandemic, etc.
Right.
And the important thing is also in the adjust part, is also to recognize that India's relations with the United States have very solid reasons behind them. And people need to understand that and adjust Russia's policy with that factor being there, not being wished away, but being there. India and Russia are in a situation in which their closest partners among the major powers have very difficult relations with the other countries. Right. So Russia's relations with China and India's relations with China, or Russia's relations with America and India's relations with America. And you just have to factor all that in. So that it doesn't mean that the relationship cannot stand. It can. It is resilient enough, but that factor needs to be taken into account. So this is the adjust part. The upgrade part is that particularly from Russia's perspective, the scope of Russian-India relations has to be upgraded to the highest level. And when talking about Asia, this is the level that China occupies. Primarily, we're talking about trade and other economic relations. So relations with China have economic relations with China have reached a point of 110 billion so far this year.
Right.
dollars. With India, it's 1/10 of that.
That's
and
right.
that needs to be changed.
Okay. Mr. Mukerji, let's get into each of these. Let's get into each of these. Now, Dr. Trenin mentioned China. In the last year and a half, we know that Indian troops and Chinese troops are facing off along the line of actual control in Ladakh. Delhi sees Moscow and Beijing as very close partners. They're in a tight embrace. Do you think that this is a key reason for the disquiet or some of the disquiet between the India-Russia relationship?
Well, Jyoti, I think, again, I would respond by saying it depends on who is expressing this disquiet. Now, people who deal with the defense issues are not expressing the disquiet. In fact, our ambassador in Moscow has publicly thanked Russia for continuing its supplies of arms to India, even after the confrontation between India and China on the border took place. And therefore, I think that, there is a problem of perception and a problem of information flow into India. India doesn't have a single correspondent in Russia, for example.
No, but can I just interrupt you there? So these pieces of defense equipment that the Russians gave India, are you saying that this happened during the standoff on the LAC last year? Is when Defense Minister Rajnath Singh went to Moscow. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Well, I can only refer you and your viewers to a very elaborate interview given by the outgoing Indian ambassador to Russia, Ambassador Venkatesh Verma. And he gave it to TASS and to Kommersant, which are big news outlets in Russia. And in that, he has mentioned and he has publicly thanked Russia for continuing to supply arms for Russian supplied equipment being used by India or during the conflict along the line of this actual control with China. But the point is that having acknowledged this is not, I think, enough. And I think in India, public opinion needs to also be aware that Russia and India have worked together after May 2020 to try and create an opportunity to address the issue through the diplomatic framework. And our External Affairs Minister's visit to Moscow in September 2020, his bilateral meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister in Moscow, and the outcome document which both sides issued at Moscow, I think is just an example of how the perception that this is a zero-sum game between India, Russia, and China is actually not true on the ground.
But can I say this, Dr. Trenin? The first is that Russia did supply defense equipment to India, to Indian troops, while the confrontation of this face-off continues to take place actually along the line of actual control with China. Was there a signal from the Russian side to the Chinese that although you have, or the two of you have such a close relationship, that there is something else on the horizon, namely India?
Well, I think that particularly the Indian audience needs to understand that the Russian-Chinese relationship is based on the principle of never being against each other, but not automatically being always with each other. And there are issues on which China and Russia take very different positions. The Chinese have long been very unhappy with Russian arms shipments to Delhi. And but Russia, being a great power in its own thinking, first of all, and that's what matters above all, does not accept that anyone, including one's a close partner, can dictate to Moscow what it should and what it should not do. There's another relationship that's currently booming, one between Moscow and Hanoi. The Vietnamese president has just been to Moscow. The defense minister has had talks with his Russian counterpart. And China is not very happy about that either. Now, China does not recognize Crimea as part of Russia. So there are many things, but the relationship is resilient enough to withstand those differences. And the two capitals, Moscow and Beijing, managed to deal with those differences so that they do not undermine the otherwise important strategic relationship. And I'm very thankful to Ambassador Mukerji for talking about the trilateral relationship between or among India, Russia, and China, the so-called BRIC format. And Russia has been trying to facilitate contacts between Delhi and Beijing, because from the Russian standpoint, adversity, not to speak of enmity between its two major strategic partners in Asia is a bad thing, a really bad thing. So Russia is trying to help both countries, both major powers, to come to terms with each other and deal with their differences.
But can I ask you here, Dr. Trenin, that when the Russians supplied defense equipment during the standoff last year, did the Chinese complain to you? Did they complain to Moscow?
Well, the Chinese, I think, first of all, I don't know what's been said privately between Russian and Chinese officials.
Okay.
I hope that they were smart enough not to raise the issue officially, because the Chinese actually realize what is acceptable, what is not acceptable to Russia. They care about the relationship with Russia enough not to be seen by Moscow as stepping on Russian toes. So they're being smart. They when necessary, they can walk around you, but they do not attack you if they understand that there'll be a pushback.
Right. So, Mr. Mukerji, can I ask you now, do you think, in the light of what Dr. Trenin said, and of course you know a lot of that already yourself, but can you tell us, in your view, do you think that the Russian president's visit to India, we've discussed the symbolism of it, the second visit only after his meeting with Joe Biden, is also a signal to China?
Well, I think the visit is a signal. If you look at the issues that are raised in the discussions between the Russian president and the Indian prime minister. And I think in this context, we must remember the major initiative that was taken in 2019 by India and Russia together, which was to get India as a strategic partner of Russia in the far east of Russia. Now, that was reciprocated by India with a huge $1 billion line of credit to sustain the opening and to create an Indian presence of footprint in the Russian Far East, which extends beyond to the Arctic regions of Russia. So I think that that is an initiative on which, as Dr. Trenin says, there's no veto of a third country on a decision that Russia will take and India will reciprocate on. And I think it's important for this summit to focus on the fact that the driver of this relationship is bilateral. It's an Indian-Russian driver. And the common point of the driver is that both countries do not accept the role of any other power to interfere in the decisions that they take. I mean, and this is something that is central to the India-Russia partnership.
Okay, but then let me ask you, Mr. Mukerji, you're talking about the Vladivostok initiative, India, giving a $1 billion line of credit. But it seems to me, and I'm a reporter in Delhi, but the Indian media, for example, of course, we all did stories about that when this happened. But in a sense, the India-Russia relationship has really fallen through the cracks. Now, Dr. Trenin talked about the patronizing Russian elite view of India. But would you also say that the Indian elite, for example, is actually quite disinterested in Russia?
Well, some sections of what you call the Indian elite may be disinterested in Russia. There are some sections of the Indian elite which is quite involved with Russia. I have been part of some initiatives taken in the last year and a half, which have tried to broaden the India-Russia partnership through something called the Ganga-Volga dialogue, which the other elite of India doesn't know anything about. So I think that it depends on who you talk to and who you listen to. But one point which is important, and I hope the summit will address this point, is that there's no Indian source of information flowing from Russia into India. So all the information about Russia that comes to India is coming through third countries, and especially through the United Kingdom and the United States. So I think that this is something that may be behind the perception that you mentioned of some elites in India not feeling that the India-Russia relationship is falling through the cracks. But on the Vladivostok initiative, for example, both countries have, from March this year, launched steps to implement it by upgrading the ports of Vladivostok and Chennai. And yet, in the general media that you speak of, there's no report of this.
So that's the point. And Dr. Trenin, perhaps I could ask you to pick up on that. In the Indian media, for example, the Vladivostok Chennai initiative or other things that happen on the energy front, for example. I mean, it's a bit of a yawn, frankly. You say, okay, so Russia is doing all this. So first of all, people don't know that much. So our sources of information are actually quite limited because diplomats don't speak famously, as you know. The Russians write in Russian. We don't, read Russian or understand Russian. So there is a huge gap in perception of each other.
Well, unfortunately, I have to agree with you. We know the situation in India. Unfortunately, the situation in Russia is only marginally better. There are Russian correspondents in place in Delhi, but the amount of information that is beamed to wider Russian audiences on India is still pretty scant. It's not to be compared, frankly, with the amount of information on China, for example. And the Russian elite remains Western-centered in their mentality, which I think is very wrong. You have to develop a 360 degrees vision if you are a Russia, or if you are a Russian. It has to include the West, it has to include the East, it has to include the South, and if you like, the North as well. But there is certainly much that needs to be done in the realm of India studies to understand the dynamic of modern India, not just the riches of its culture, the riches of its history, but where this big and increasingly ambitious country is going to. And taking India for granted, which a lot of Russians still do, is not the right way forward. And but that's my argument to my Russian colleagues, and I very much agree with what Ambassador Mukerji has just said. If suppose the Russians were only learning about India via Beijing, or via some other place that's not necessarily well disposed toward India, and then you would have a very different picture of India in the Russian mind. So, if anything, I would very much support increased dialogue, increased communication, and the media, I think, should be in the vanguard of that.
Right. So, can I ask you, Mr. Mukerji? We've talked about, you're insisting that there are only some elites that don't look carefully at this very warm relationship that has still held its ground despite all the tensions. But for example, in India, we talk a lot about how President Putin himself, while he is an elected president, but has been in power, whether he's president or prime minister, for more than 20 years. So how can a democratic Russia elect the same man over and over again? I mean, I should ask Dr. Trenin that question, but let me see. But why don't I ask you first and tell you what you think about it?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think part of the answer to that question lies in the events that happened in 1991, 92, when the new Russian constitution was drafted.
When the Soviet Union broke up.
When the Soviet Union broke up, but the people who drafted the new Russian constitution were all schooled in American democracy. And this is not a secret. It's in Stroke Talbert's book. It's in so many other books on Russia of the 1990s. So somewhere along the road, the system that was created, the political system, was created through the churn of the 1990s. And I think that people should remember that, because, when we talk of democracy, it also is linked to the context in which democracy came up. But I'd like to actually take on the point that you're making about the longevity. And I think that this is something that I have seen myself from 2002 onwards, from the second summit onwards, the role of President Putin in actually conceptualizing the strategic partnership. I mean, he's the one who proposed the partnership in October 2000. And this has, for whatever reason, but he's been the one constant figure in the India-Russia strategic partnership for 21 years. And I think that invests a certain amount of interest in the Russian top leadership and the Russian elites in the relationship with India. Now, our job is to actually see how can this be broadened. And I think that here, as Dr. Trenin has mentioned, the role of the media is very important. But given the reality of India today, the role of the private sector, which dominates the Indian media, is equally important. So I would hope very much that Indian private sector entities who have an interest in media would take the effort, the initiative to actually position their people for the sake of their own business development in Russia, in which there's a huge amount of, say, raw materials, resources, et cetera, et cetera. We know all the potential. But how do you tap the potential? I think the tapping of the potential has to be done by the Indian private sector in a more energetic manner, and not relying only on the government of India to identify areas and tell them that you take this line of credit and go there. I think that they need to do that. And therefore, the key to this, and I hope the summit addresses this, is to get the financial services sectors of India and Russia to interact more closely with each other. Given the big constraint, which is the Vanco's ghost in this relationship, is the sanctions on Russia. There are unilateral sanctions on Russia, and Russia has to find a way around these sanctions to deal with India. And we have seen it in the S-400 case, but it applies equally to the economic issues. So how do our financial institutions interact with each other? And I think a key decision here, a government decision in Russia, is to lift the restriction on the State Bank of India from opening a branch in Russia. In 2002, State Bank was forced to open a commercial bank in Russia, and not a branch of State Bank of India.
Right. I get your point, Mr. Mukerji. I'm going to, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you here, and I'm going to ask Dr. Trenin the same question I asked you, which is the Putin question. Dr. Trenin, one of the things that we talk about in India a lot is that the same man, Vladimir Putin, has been elected time and again, sometimes as president, sometimes as prime minister. We don't know how free and fair that election is. I'm not saying that he's not an elected president and he's not a powerful president. He's a very, very powerful leader. Prime Minister Modi, for example, has been elected the second time around by a majority of India's electorate. Nobody, we may criticize him, but he's an elected leader and he's firmly there. But the question that he's been around, that Putin has been around for more than 20 years, does that give some discomfort to people in Russia?
Well, I think as Ambassador Mukerji would say, there are some people, there are some sections that are discomforted for that. If you go beyond that circle, which is very vocal, but relatively small, not relatively, but nominally also very small. The bulk of the people of Russia today would still look around them and say, well, we have that guy in office, that person in office, he is competent, and let him stay in power. And I think that's Russian people would prize stability above many other things. And I think there's a universal there's a universal problem. And this problem is that if you want to impose, introduce a political system on a country whose political culture is not necessarily in sync with that political system, then you will have trouble.
What are you referring to?
Well, I'm referring to the Russian Constitution of 1993, which, in my view, and I've been saying that publicly for a long time, it's actually written for another country. It's written for a cross between the United States of America and the French Republic. Mm-hmm. That's basically the intellectual, conceptual foundation of the Russian Constitution. The Russian political culture is very different from the political cultures of Europe or of North America. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, has to be taken into account. Putin has been able to use the Constitution with minimal changes to run the country in the way that the country is accustomed to. And the most important thing about Putin's reign, however long it may last, is that throughout he's been supported by a considerable majority of the Russian people. And to rule a country like Russia, unlike ruling many other countries, you cannot say, well, I polled 100,000 more votes than my opponent. In Russia, 49-51 is a recipe for a civil war. You can rule the country comfortably if you have 2/3 behind you. Mm-hmm. You can rule gloriously if you have, as Putin did for a period of time, 80%. But if you go down to 50, you should be very, very careful. Because in Russia, again, the political culture is different. And it has to be, you may like it, you may dislike it, you may want to change it, but all change will come only gradually.
Right. So let me bring you both to the present a little bit. And I'm talking about the Russia-India-China Trilateral meeting last week, in which the foreign ministers of the three countries, Mr. Jaishankar from Sergei Lavrov of Russia and Wang Yi of China, attended this virtual summit. So to you, Mr. Mukerji, there was this difference of opinion, if you like, nothing wrong with differences of opinion, but this seems to be a bit more fundamental than that, which is about the description of the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific. Now, India and the US call it the Indo-Pacific, while China and Russia like to call it the Asia-Pacific. Now, you would say, what's in a name? But I would say to you that that's a fundamental difference of opinion between India and Russia and China. So do you think this is enough to make or break something and a relationship between the two? Our two countries.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jyoti, for asking that. I think that this is something that is probably an issue between the foreign ministry of the three countries. But on the ground, I think it doesn't really make a difference, because most people, I think, may not know but should know that when the United States talks of the Indo-Pacific, it only talks of the water from Bombay to the western coast of the United States and leaves out the entire area between Mumbai and the Red Sea. Which is for India the most important part of this body of water. I mean, the sea lane and the digital lanes of communication, which connect India to the bigger world, come through this part of the Indo-Pacific, which is from the Red Sea to the shores of India. So I think the two countries, India and the United States, are on different pages when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And the fact that within the United States, it's the central command of the United States which controls this space which India considers important. From the Red Sea to the shores of India includes Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, and so on. So that's out of the Indo-Pacific as far as the United States is concerned. And therefore, for those who understand it, will not take this divergence very seriously. And for me, someone who's done multilateral diplomacy, we are elected by the Asia-Pacific group. We are not elected by the Indo-Pacific group as a member of the Security Council. There are 54 states in the Asia-Pacific. So I think that this is something that needs to be kept in mind. And the last point is that if we are interested in maritime security of this body of water of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, then in August this year, when India decided to convene this Security Council debate on maritime security, only President Putin showed up. None of the partners of India's Quad or any other alliance or partnerships, etc., showed up. And that speaks for itself. That and the fact that Russia has just conducted its first naval exercise in ASEAN off the coast of Sumatra 2 days ago demonstrates that for India and for Russia, it's ASEAN that is central to this entire body of water of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. So I don't know where this divergence will lead to.
So, Dr. Trenin, can I ask you this? The Quad, is this something that Russia is uncomfortable with it, India being a member of the Quadrilateral Alliance, which is Australia, Japan, US, and India?
Well, I think if you carefully read the statements by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, there is some apprehension because clearly for the United States, the biggest issue, the biggest challenge, and the biggest potential threat is China. And for the United States, the relationship with India is important. It's important in many ways, but one of the most important ways in which it's important is that it allows the United States to pressure China more effectively. And that, I think, is not lost on the Russians. Clearly, they do not regard the Quad as an alliance, as some sort of a new bloc. But they're watching very carefully not so much the Indian activities within the Quad, but where the United States would want to push the Quad, because they see the Quad as an extension of the U.S.-led system of alliances and relationships. The problem that the Russians see is that in any alliance, any partnership with the United States, there's only one boss. There's only one leading partner. And everyone else is sort of adjusting to that, following or adjusting to that partnership. That's the concern. Again, I'll be very frank about that. With regard to Asia Pacific versus Indo-Pacific, I think you would appreciate that the term Asia Pacific was also coined in the United States. It's just an earlier term than the Indo-Pacific. And when it was embraced by Gorbachev in the 1980s, that meant an extension of the Russian Soviet in those days strategic thinking beyond the water's edge into the Pacific. There was always an Asia dimension to Russian foreign policy. Now it included the Pacific. Russia is predominantly a continental power. The United States is predominantly a maritime power. So for the United States, oceans are, let's say, more important because that's how the United States reaches out to the rest of the world. Now, Russia in that case is looking at the world very differently. Now, the problem that I see with the Indo-Pacific is that on the Russian side is that for some people there's a confusion between the Indian concept of the Indo-Pacific and the American concept, because the American concept essentially, again, I'll be very blunt again, it extends the front line with China all the way to India and the Indian Ocean. That's the idea. Because the United States is really focused on China and will stay focused on China for a long time. The United States is nothing if not the dominant power. That is not the number one, and China challenges that. So it's logical that the United States should do that. But India has its own view, and my problem in Moscow is that the Indian view needs to be seen for what it is, not as an extension of the American conceptual line or American policy. India as a major power that has its own interests, that follows its own policies, has to be appreciated for what it is. For Russia, again, and that's the final thought on that, the overarching concept, as we all know, is the Greater Eurasian Partnership, which means that you sit in Moscow, you look at China, you look at India, you look at Europe, you look at ASEAN, and that's your world, and that's your Greater Eurasia.
But, thank you for being so frank about this, Dr. Trenin. One quick question. When Sergei Lavrov says these things and then he comes to Delhi, and from Delhi he goes to Pakistan, which is highly insensitive in New Delhi's perception, there was absolutely no need for him to do that, however much you want to appease Rawalpindi on the Taliban question. So I would argue with you that the Russians need to be a little bit more sensitive about India's views as well. Would you agree?
Well, I think that, first of all, I agree that one has to be very sensitive to one's partners. That certainly includes India in the first instance. I would very much agree with that. The relationship with Pakistan cannot be, Russia's relationship with Pakistan cannot be equated in any way and form with the relationship with India. Pakistan is important primarily in the context of Afghanistan, and it's an urgent issue that needs to be dealt with, and all that. So it's not that Russia is reaching out to Pakistan to spike India, to pay back for India's rapprochement with the United States. That would be a very short-sighted and very wrong perception, in my view. But I agree with you. In diplomacy in particular, your style matters, your specific moves matter a lot, and you do not want to create more problems than you already have with various countries. And with your close partners, I think you should be more considerate. You should be more, let's say, sensitive to your partners. And that works both ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. So last couple of questions, Mr. Mukerji, to you. You mentioned the S-400 missile systems earlier. Now, this we know is a very sophisticated missile system, which India has partially paid for at least. The delivery of the first of those missiles is expected to be very soon. It was supposed to be end of this year, so I hope in some weeks from now. But the question is that, in your view, there is this argument that's taking place inside Delhi, which is that the Americans are very unhappy that India continues to buy such sophisticated defense equipment from the Russians. In your view, how should India balance these two relationships, India-US and India-Russia?
Jyoti, the two relationships actually stand on different pillars. And the India-United States relationship is a very broad relationship, which has...
it's a very good one. It has, $100 billion.
Yes, but there are two pillars which actually support and sustain that relationship, which are the private sector engagement and the huge Indian diaspora, the Indian origin diaspora, from where the top 8 technology companies of the United States have drawn their CEOs in recent years. So this is these are pillars which are not available to the India-Russia partnership, neither the private sector engagement nor the diaspora.
But let's talk about defense. Let's talk about S-400.
So therefore, when we talk of defense and the S-400, you have to see where these items, this equipment is going to be deployed. It's going to be deployed along the land borders. There is no one expecting the S-400s to be deployed in the Indo-Pacific. So therefore, there is a certain logic to the India-Russia defense partnership, which goes back. I mean, this is the 50th anniversary of the 1971 treaty between India and Russia and the Soviet Union, which introduced this military dimension in a more dramatic and substantial manner. And that relationship has been sustained even through the tempestuous 1990s when Russia underwent changes and India underwent changes.
But how do you, sorry to interrupt you again, but how would you, what do you think India should do if the Americans come down breathing heavily on you and they say to you that, listen, you have to, otherwise, sanctions will be imposed. And you talked about the State Bank of India trying to open its branches, but sanctions are still existent on that. How do you think India should, what do you think India should do?
Jyoti, you asked me a question, and I'm sorry it takes me back a little while, but in 1985, we tried to
That's really a long time ago.
1985, with Ronald Reagan's administration, we tried to get a supercomputer from the United States, which was supported by the private sector in Chicago, and the senator from Chicago was Richard Lugar. But the United States prevented that supercomputer from coming. They prevented us from buying the supercomputer from Japan's NEC, and it resulted in India introducing its own Param supercomputer.
But that's the Cold War, Mr. Mukerji. That is the Cold War, and today we are talking, it's 20 years, the Cold War is
20 years later, the Cold War may have receded, but what has not receded, and I think what binds India and Russia together, is that we do not accept the extraterritorial application of American domestic laws. This is, as an Indian who has grown up in an independent country, we have our own laws which govern our own policies and our own jurisdictions, and so does Russia. So I think that the expectation that a third country will apply its laws, whatever they are, which it has formulated through its own processes, onto third countries is untenable in international relations and in international law. And I think that that's the answer that I would give to anybody who has these problems about the S-400 coming between as a contract between India and Russia. Apply your laws to your own jurisdiction, but don't apply your laws to third jurisdictions. That's the principle on which international cooperation is based. If you don't accept that principle, then you are opening a Pandora's box.
Okay, Dr. Trenin, last question to you. So, at the end of this discussion, what would you say? What is the importance of the Putin visit to India? Do you think he understands India? Of course, he's an old KGB agent. He's been in power for so long. He understands power, like Prime Minister Modi. They both understand power. So in your view, what is the significance of this, considering the geopolitical flux that both nations are facing today?
Well, I think that the fact that the visit is taking place, the fact that it was not reformatted into a video conference, speaks volumes about the importance of India in the Russian strategic thinking. In the most recent documents passed by Russia, including the National Security Strategy, put India and China in the same paragraph, not one paragraph after the other. It's the same quality, same caliber of relations in the Russian mind. It's very important. So I think that this visit is symbolic, but I hope it will also result in some headway. My proposition, and I very much like what Ambassador Mukerji has just said, my proposition for both the Russian and the Indian leaderships is that they appoint a panel of people who would do research into the potential for upgrading the Indo-Russian relationship from $10 billion eventually to $100 billion. Clearly not in one big leap, but in many stages. Then there must be areas where the private sector of India and the private sector of Russia can productively collaborate, do business with each other, that are not seen because there's not enough information, not enough research, not enough attention to the other country. So I think that the two leaders have an obligation to take the two great countries, the two societies up that road of an upgrade.
Right. This has been a fascinating discussion, gentlemen, Dr. Trenin and Asoke Mukerji. I think the fact that there is so much to talk about, the fact that the Putin visit is definitely, the meeting with Prime Minister Modi is definitely going to set the course of the relationship in the years to come, is very clear. I would just say that I think Prime Minister Modi, like former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi said several years ago to an American audience, that India doesn't lean to the left or to the right, but it stands independent and upright. And I think that would be the message. And that holds true today as well. But thank you both so much for your time. Dr. Trenin in Moscow and Asoke Mukerji in Delhi, thank you again for joining the Print Debates.
Thank you very much, Jyoti, for